When I was, I suppose, about 8 years old, I received my first chemistry set, like many, many other youngsters at that age, and really just became infatuated with the whole idea, and had very early in mind the idea of becoming a research chemist, as I maintained and built the laboratory all the way up through my grade school years and into high school, and was fully planning on becoming a research chemist before, of course, I enlisted in the Navy. But at that time, I also had music as a hobby, which I still have today. I started out playing the bugle in a drum and bugle corps in our local area, and then progressed to trumpet when I was in third grade, and studied trumpet rather assiduously all the way up through high school, played in dance bands and in the school band and school orchestra. So that was pretty much consisting of my formative years, this kind of interest, if you will, in science, but also in music. And that's been maintained over the course of my life. Well, approximately 1945, I went into the Navy and spent roughly a year and a half in the Navy, came out and started at Penn immediately on a scholarship. And at that juncture, I had a lot of interest in the area of research chemistry. And ironically, it turned out that the advanced courses that I had wanted to take, since I had waived the elementary courses, were all filled with pre-med students. So I ended up as a stopgap in majoring in economics and mathematics. Economics because I wanted to get a job, and mathematics because I liked it. And in that process, I went through 4 years of school at Penn, graduated, and then like many of my colleagues that were in the service, went on to a job. When I then elected to go back while working at Sun Oil and pursue graduate study, I then majored in statistics and really kept that major throughout my whole career, for going on for the doctorate and so on. So while I worked in marketing applications for the most part in my workaday world, my formal training was much more so in statistics. And actually, all of my advanced degrees are in statistics. The first job I had was at the Sun Oil Company, and I was there for a few years, and started to work in their statistical research area, which then gave me the opportunity to take graduate courses, also at Penn, in the area of statistics. So I was pursuing at that juncture time in both university and at work. I was then approached by Luke & Steel Company out in Coatesville. They're makers of steel plate. And to set up a kind of research department there that dealt with doing market surveys and studies for their basic customers. That led to some research that I started to do in the area of what we call operations research, which is the application of mathematics and statistics and other kinds of techniques to business-type problems. So I set up a small operations research group at that juncture, stayed there for a while, went back, started on my doctorate at Penn while I was still working at Luke & Steel, and stayed there at Penn for a full semester to satisfy the residency requirements. Upon having done that, went back to Luke & Steel again, but was approached by DuPont to head up a small group in planning, business-type planning and market planning. So I was there until I'd gotten a call from McKinsey Company. This whole period of time ensued from approximately 1950 to about 1958. And they were quite interested in some of the work I'd published under the aegis of DuPont, and were planning to offer me a rather interesting job in New York City. But at the same time, I was finishing up then my doctorate at Penn and in statistics. And at that juncture, I got fairly friendly with the major figure in marketing at that time, Wroe Alderson, who had joined the marketing department after a successful career in business in his own marketing consulting firm. And he, being the better arguer, I suppose, than the McKinsey folks, talked me into staying on at Penn, becoming both a professor eventually and also a researcher in his new marketing consulting firm called Behavior Systems. So I worked those two jobs up at that time until Wroe himself died in 1965 at the age of 68. And then I was pretty well started in my career in the marketing department. My initial interest in marketing research was really industry-oriented. This is while I had finished up college, and I had played in some groups, music groups at that time, to sort of also pass the time while I was in college. And working in marketing research at Sun Oil Company, and then later on Luke and Steel Company, and then later on still in DuPont, gave me a lot of practical experience in developing studies that needed practical application. So most of my work today always has in mind a kind of client. In other words, why am I doing this? What good would it do? And where the emphasis, at least on my part and the part of many of my colleagues, is to try to develop new ideas, hopefully that are fairly exciting, at least to people in research, that also have applicability in the area of business, which after all, that's the kind of school I'm in, being at Wharton. So most of the studies that I've done and most of the techniques I've had a chance to work on, again with many others, many other talented people, I've used in various applications. My dissertation was on, at that time, a fairly arcane a series of ideas that were being espoused by statisticians on looking at statistics not in the usual way in which you use statistical methods maybe to estimate certain quantities or to set up certain confidence intervals about some particular statistic being correct or not, but to view it in a much more direct decision-making way, that virtually all the time we're trying to make decisions under uncertainty where we're not really sure of the outcomes and the consequences. If we try to formalize that, we would say under certain kinds of conditions, maybe this course of action is correct. I know in others, perhaps some other course of action is correct. What all decision theorists are trying to do is to formalize these notions and to set up models or paradigms that a, quote, rational person might utilize to improve his or her decision making. So basically what we're looking at is setting up these models that look at consequences, a whole spectrum of possible consequences, some of which will be good for us, some not so good. Perhaps apply probabilities to their occurrence, and if so, what our particular course of action should be. So statistics itself, and I'm just going along essentially with the gang, has been changed very markedly from a sort of passive type of science dealing with what we call estimation theory and hypothesis testing to embodying some of these same techniques in action-oriented pursuits. I think the whole field of decision statistics, decision-making statistics, has not only fascinated me, but many other people working in the field, where they've seen from these kinds of new models and approaches, some of which are called Bayesian decision theory, which is what my dissertation was in. And they're seeing these approaches being applied to actual problems as opposed to, as I say, more passive kinds of measurements and estimation. Because of my industrial experience of 12 years in total, I had the opportunity, the very good opportunity and rare opportunity, to do the dissertation in a real-life setting, namely at DuPont. So I developed some models and techniques based on these new kinds of techniques for decision-making and applied them to some company problems, including also what we call, at that time, von Neumann-Morgenstern utility theory, and that had to do with how people valued various kinds of things. And so I was able to apply both the statistical decision theory part and the value theory part to some real problems at DuPont. And I'm grateful for that and happy about that because it gave me again a bent that says basically what I want to do with my life is to apply some of these models and see them used in the real life situations. And I pretty much followed that course for the last 40 years. When I joined the marketing department, and this was basically as a professor, associate professor in 1962, the department consisted of approximately 10 people. There was a group of people that one might call institutionalists that really were concerned with marketing as a phenomenon and trying to understand why cooperatives develop and what distribution costs are all about and so on. They took a rather global view as opposed to a view related to management problems. And several of the major figures at that point, except I would think Wroe Alderson, were of that persuasion, that they were really interested in institutional descriptions, taxonomies of how goods get produced and so on, without that much attention being given to working on methodologies or techniques for business people. Alderson was the exception, and primarily that was true because of the work that he actually did in consulting in addition to his theory, production, and areas in teaching itself. So effectively, he distinguished himself from the others in that kind of focus. And of course, that was the perfect focus for me, given my own background, which paralleled in a minor way that of his, having worked both in industry and also in academia. Well, one of the high moments of my career and my life was meeting Wroe Alderson, who at that time was the peer, sort of without peer, one could argue, person in the field of marketing, particularly marketing theory. He was a major figure in the marketing department at Wharton, having been there himself only about 5 or 6 years before I joined the department as not exactly a rookie. I came in as an associate professor because I had some prior publications. But under his tutelage, I not only worked in his behavior systems group, but I learned an awful lot about marketing theory and about marketing techniques. And the very first book that I did was with Wroe as the principal author, and I was second author on that book. It was called Planning and Problem Solving in Marketing. And to this day, he is viewed by people who perhaps were never alive, or at least never met him, to be one of the major figures in the field of marketing theory, because we're talking way back in probably 1955, 56, along in there. And he came out with a number of ideas that are as fresh today as they were when he developed them. So I was fortunate in that respect, and also with respect to my thesis advisor, Morris Hamburg, who's still alive, I'm happy to say. I was his very first PhD student, he being a young instructor at the time. And then I was doubly lucky to have Simon Kuznets, who was a Nobel Prize winner, serve as my dissertation advisor for the master's thesis. So I was really blessed with a bounty of extremely good intellects to sort of help this kind of character myself along. Jerry Wind has been a collaborator of mine for many, many years. We're very fast friends and have been family-wise as long as he's been here. He came to Wharton in 1966, so he's one of the early arrivals as we moved into the new regime of people that we have. We immediately got started on research and did a fair amount of work. He was primarily responsible for obtaining the Marriott project, which I worked on with him and several other people. So over the years, we have done a tremendous amount of collaboration. He's a very close friend. The second individual, I'm really talking from that point forward, that I work with and learn so much from is Doug Carroll, who is a psychometrician over at Bell Labs. Again, we go back a long, long period of time. And most of what I've learned in psychometrics, multidimensional scaling, particularly, and to some extent in clustering, has been through projects that I've done with Doug and the force of his intellect. So I'm highly indebted to him. Going back to my thesis advisor, Morris Hamburg, clearly he's influenced my work. Simon Kuznets has influenced my work. And the last, and many of my PhD students, Joe Huber comes to mind, Wayne DeSarbo, Arun Jain, Vitala Rao. So certainly my PhD students were not only just students of mine, of course that would have been fine too, but they were collaborators. And in the old days, where there were very few of us that were doing dissertation supervision, it was almost as though they were collaborators, and indeed did serve as co-authors on many of our papers. So I owe an awful lot to my PhD students, and they've all been quite successful after they got out on their own, and we still do work together from time to time. Simon Kuznets, the Nobel winner, obviously I learned a lot from him, and certainly from Morris Hamburg, my dissertation advisor, and we're still very good friends. So these are the kinds of influences that I've had. More recently, but certainly nonetheless important, very vital to what I've done, is the last 20 years with basically, or primarily, Abba Krieger, who is a very fine statistician, mathematician in the statistics department. And we've co-authored something like 52 different articles together over that time. He's been involved in many of these projects that I've talked about and played a very important role, and particularly in the one dealing with traffic pulse involving computers. He's also a highly skilled computer programmer. So we have a small company, just the two of us, that does these kinds of work, and we do all the work. We don't farm it out to PhD students or things of that sort, because we want to be sure that if it doesn't get done right, we have to take responsibility for it. And we ply our trade, so to speak, involving these techniques with various people from the Fortune 500 and others, and enjoy doing it because we learn so much from them. One of the best sources of ideas comes from the client. And when they come up with something and say, oh, gee, we never tried the technique for that particular purpose. And there's so many of them, I can't really just cite that many, would not be fair to the others, but to realize that that is a big source of ideas that in turn you can develop techniques for to help solve those problems. So I've had many, many collaborators, many, many benefactors, and it's just been a marvelous time. A good friend of mine, Don Morrison, always says, "What?" when he sees me, and he's a good researcher himself, he says, "You still in the trenches, Green?" Because I have never really gotten out of them. I figured being a professor is the best job in the world, certainly the best in the university. I never was really good or wanted to be good at administration. I tried to just sort of do what I'm supposed to do and try to be a good spear carrier in that sense. But I really loved research. I mean, you don't do this thing for 40 years and not have a passion about it. And every time I see an article, I've done scads of them, it's like all over, you're still glowing when something gets published because that's their only work product. When you talk to students, they get something, but it goes. It doesn't stay in the world. And that's good enough for me.